Okay, so we're going to talk about, so the first question is, explain the pressure volume curve for a single cardiac cycle. So what we have is let's go ahead and draw this little graph right here. And this is going to represent basically the pressure volume loop. So we're just going to draw this real quick. So what we first have going on would be in order to let blood in, we have our AV valve right here at this point. It's opening. So then we have basically a cascade of blood coming into, so this whole thing right here, this is the ventricle. I should probably put that we have volume down here and we have pressure, which is measured in millimeters of mercury. This one is going to be just milliliters, okay? So we have our AV valve opening, which is then going to push blood into the ventricle, and then right here is when we are going to close the AV valve. And this is what causes our first sound, which is lub. And then at this point, from here to here, this would be known as isovolumic contraction. So the ventricle is now filled with blood and we can start contracting. And then at this point right here, this top point, we have the semilunar valve opening. And then it closes right here. And then this is responsible for our second sound, which is dub. Okay, and then we have our end diastolic on this end, and we are currently looking at the left lateral ventricle. And then right here, this would be our, stroke volume. Okay, so we have our end diastolic volume on this side, end diastolic on this side, and systolic on this side. So, this is happening within our left ventricle, but here, so we're going to talk about inotropy. Inotropy is a force of contraction in which the heart has enough blood to be able to pump. So, if we look at it like this, inotropy, we could say, wow, that's actually awful. That's awful. Okay, that's inotropy, sorry. Okay, so this is our inotropic line. And this will be how much force that is being able to be pumped, blood being able to be pumped. So notice that we go up in pressure, but volume doesn't change very much. So anything making contractions force more, right? And then this also pertains to our elastance, which is our change in pressure over change in volume, which is equal to the slope. So, and then at this point right here, we could say this is our max contraction. Yeah. So, more contraction. So basically, if we have an increase in contraction, then that means we're going to have an increase in calcium, which is going to lead to an increase in inotropy and elastance. And then compliance, which is inverse of elastance. It's basically so like say if we have a heart with a lot of compliance, it has little or a lot of elastance. And then we also can get into preload at this point. So preload is going to, so preload is, okay, hold on, sorry. Preload is the amount of stretch in myocytes. Cardiac sarcomeres before contraction. You turn all my skies to pouring rain, lock me out the house again. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and draw this little chart again, but this time we're talking about preloads. So say our preload right here, this is our normal one, and then right here this is going to be known as our control, and then at this point right here, this is going to be when our preload increases. So this is an increase in preload. This is a decrease in preload. So we have pressure here, and then we have volume again, and then we have our inotropic line, and this little curve right there. Okay, perfect. So right here you can see that, so we have preload, which is the amount of stretch in the cardiac sarcomeres before contraction. Sorry, I just realized how loud that is. So when we have a decrease in preload, that means that there's going to be less volume in the ventricles, as well as there being less pressure in order to get to this point up here. And this is our inotropic line, which again is the force of contraction. So you don't need a lot of contraction here because there's a decrease in blood. So right here you have an increase in preload, which means that we have more blood being able to fill the ventricles, which is causing an increase in pressure and volume as well. Yeah. So it's basically the heart is pumping what it gets, and with a higher preload leads to a greater force in contraction. So increase in preload is equal to a greater force of contraction. And this is because an increased preload stretches the sarcomeres, which means we have more G-actin active sites exposed to myosin, which increases the driving force reduction without increased calcium source influx. So increasing venous return would increase stroke volume. So we would say increase in venous return is equal to an increase in stroke volume. And then we also talk about afterload, which is basically not the same concept, but we're going to draw this, and then let's see, it's a little something like this. This is going to be our afterload. And this is when, so let's do pressure. Oops. Pressure. And then we have our volume down here. So if you have a decrease in afterload, actually, let me tell you what afterload is before I actually talk about the decrease. So afterload, we can think of this being the force against which the heart must pump in order to expel blood into the vasculature, and to the rest of the body, to the lungs, body, anything like that. So force against the rest of the body. Okay, anyways, so with that definition, if we decrease after load, we're not getting very much of like an increase in pressure nor volume. You would see a decrease in those. And then this line right here, this is technically our control and the amount of force that is being generated. And then if you increase after load, you'll see that we get an increase in pressure, but not an increase in volume. Volume still stays the same. It's still in alignment with the decrease in afterload, but the pressure increases, and that's where it gets a little kind of like, why would pressure increase when volume's not increasing? Because you would think that those two would correlate with each other, but I guess they don't. And that's because what's happening is that there's a lot of stretch, but not enough stretch that the volume needs to go up. So arterial elastance, which is represented basically by like this little one right here. Arterial resistance is when the pressure volume loop is between the pressure, it's between the closing of the aortic valve and the closing of the semilunar valve. So you'll have vasodilation, which is like a common way to increase afterload. And then afterload increases, inotropy stays the same. So increase in afterload means that inotropy stays the same. And the amount of blood exiting the heart would decrease. Alright, which means that our stroke volume would also decrease, but inotropy still remains the same, because its amount of myosin and actin overlapping is consistent. So now the next question is for us to explain the mechanism by which fluids move out of the capillaries and into the capillaries. So this is capillary exchange, and we're going to describe the various forces involved, like the hydrostatic pressure, the colloid, osmotic pressure, all of that, and how they differ at the arterial and the venous ends of capillaries. So, let's see. We're just going to draw this line right here and another line right here. Alright, so this is going to be our arterioles, and then this is going to be our venules. Arterioles are going to run to about there and there, and then venules will make, sorry, that is the completely wrong color that I want to use. Arterioles here, venules here. Okay, not very even, but I feel as though you should get the point. So, hydrostatic pressure. And then hydrostatic pressure, we're going to draw in here, and it's going to rest at about, it wants to go out, so a positive 30. And then BCOP wants to go in, so BCOP, blood colloid osmotic pressure, is going to want to go in, and that one's around -28. And then we have ICOP, which is going to want to go out. This one is a positive 8, and then IF P is going to want to go out as well, and that's a positive 3. And then, so we could say that HP, 30, and then B cup, sorry, so 38, 3, 41, and then we'll minus 28 from that, and this is going to be our net out, which is going to be a positive 13. 13 out. And then the same thing is going to happen over here, except that the hydrostatic pressure is going to be different. Hydrostatic pressure is going to be out, positive 10. B cup will be going in, 28. And then again, we'll have our ICOP, intercolloid pressure, which is going to go out, 8 plus. And then IFP, interstitial fluid pressure, positive 3. And then this is going to be going in. Okay, so at the arterial end, at this side, the function in the capillary exchange is to drive fluid and solutes out of the capillary, which is going to be around like 30 millimeters of mercury. And if the mean arterial pressure is sustained above 160, then the capillary sphincters, so we'll have like a little capillary sphincter right here, can't compensate and capillaries might pop. So I'm going to draw another little graph, kind of like the capillaries, but right here, this would basically be our sphincter. And again, we would have the arterial ends and then the venule ends. So, blood colloid osmotic pressure is the pressure in the capillaries caused by the concentration of plasma proteins. It's caused by the plasma protein. So this picture right here is just basically showing our values, but this one is going to show us a bit more in depth of kind of like helping to maintain the blood pressure. I'm actually going to go over to this end. So with our B cup albumin, we have like these little proteins out here, plasma proteins that are basically albumin, but they can't pass through the capillary walls because it might pop. They just can't pop through the capillary walls. So colloid, it's a really big solute. The concentration of solutes that can't leave the capillary. So primarily plasma, albumin. Albumin can't fit between the pores of the endothelial cells, and the endothelial cells are just basically lining this capillary right here. And the function in the capillary exchange is to move fluid into the capillary because of the high concentration of albumin, which rests at like 28 millimeters of mercury. And we have our intercolloidal osmotic pressure, which is interstitial, which is showing us that there's no solutes in the capillary. So the osmotic gradient, which would be around 8 millimeters of mercury. I don't know where I got 80 from. 8 millimeters of mercury. And this one, this is where we're gonna want to move water out of the capillaries. So when you move that, when you go out of the cell, water is going to follow, which is basically going to suction, pulling fluid away from the interstitial space because of the lymphatic vessels. And then you have your hydrostatic pressure, which I don't think I said anything about. Yeah, I did. Okay. So some problems that could occur, like, within this whole exchange would be edema, which is an abnormal accumulation of fluid in the interstitium. So we have our hydrostatic edema, which is a type of edema caused by an increase in hydrostatic pressure. So if you have an increase in hydrostatic pressure, that means the mean arterial pressure is above 160 millimeters of mercury for a long time, so more blood can move past these pre-capillary sphincters than normal, which could cause like a clot on the venous side, which will increase pressure, and that means that there's less fluid to be reclaimed. Or we have like permeability edema, which is caused by the permeability of capillaries or interstitial membranes. That's because macromolecules can cross and increase intercolloidal osmotic pressure. That means that we are basically drawing water out of the cell, and more of it is just going to keep leaving and building up within the interstitium. So some things like that could happen would be like trauma, like physical trauma to like the skin, like a burn or a wound that would cause inflammation. We also have lymphedema, and that's like damage to your lymph vessels, which obstructs the lymph flow. Or we have osmotic edema, which means that we have a lower plasma osmolarity in here than the extracellular fluid osmolarity, causing the water to move out from the capillaries into the interstitium. And some things like that could be liver failure, excessive water intake, or increase ADH, which is your anti-diuretic hormone. Okay, now we're gonna talk about mean arterial pressure, which is MAP. So MAP is mean arterial pressure, and that so the equation for this would be our cardiac output times our peripheral resistance. This is also calculated by weighted average of the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So we could do, I don't know, we're not going to mess with that though. So let's say we have, actually, I'm going to move here. MAP is equal to cardiac output times peripheral resistance. So we're going to draw this right here. And let's say we have in diastolic longer than systole. It would... So I really like this drawing that Talmage has. So it's the large arteries. And then this would basically be time. And then right here would be the arterioles. And then capillaries, and then we have our veins. So smooth muscle, and then we have our pressure here. Okay, let's say 30. 120, and then 80, because when we're talking about diastolic and systole, so you have diastolic over systolic, which is your like your blood pressure, which is like 120 over 80, which is considered normal. So say, so this is going to be showing the amount of pressure that's created from the blood being pumped into the arteries. So in here in the aorta, we're going to have the greatest amount of pressure within the aorta at the very beginning, and then as we start to move towards the arterioles, the pressure starts to decrease, and then once we get to the capillaries, that's kind of like when it all just simply flows off. So we have our cardiac output, which is equal to stroke volume times heart rate, which then, you know, goes into our SPR. Okay, mean arterial pressure, and then it's supposed to be less than -6, not -6, sorry, it's supposed to be less than 63. If it's anything less than that, then you would pass out. And then we have our peripheral resistance, which is 8VL over pi times R square root, and then 2 obesity, yeah, and then we also have our flow weight. I don't know why I said it like that. Flow rate, which is the change in pressure over peripheral resistance, and then when cardiac output is equal to change in pressure times square root of pi to the square root of r times 4, 8VL. Yeah, that is our mean arterial pressure. The only thing you really need to get from this is that we have the most amount of pressure in the aorta, and then in the arterioles, that's when it starts to die off, but in the capillaries, that's when it basically, there's nothing else there. So arterioles funnel the blood and decrease the pressure, and then the blood reaches the capillaries as the pressure reaches around 30 millimeters of mercury. Yeah. Baroreceptor reflex. So our baroreceptor reflex is basically responding to blood pressure. Wow, what was that? To blood pressure. So what we have going on is a baroreceptor is a receptor that senses pressure in the aortic arch and the cardoid sinuses. And there's 2 different pathways that it can take. So we have our, we have our heart rate here, and I can't do this anymore. Hello? Anyways, so let's say we have our semilunar valve right here. So this would be our baroreceptor. And it's going to sense stretch in the aortic arch and the cardoid sinuses. So let me go ahead and move this down actually just a little bit. So right here, let's say that this is our cardoid sinus. Which is basically where we sense stretch, and this would be our stretch receptor. And we have actually 2 of these, so I'm going to duplicate this and move that here and get rid of this. Okay, and then this is actually going to go ahead and leak out over to this area, which is going to go to our brainstem and the autonomic nervous system. So, it can go to different areas of the brain. So we have two different pathways. So we have afferent, which means that we are going to, no, I can't think right now. Anyways, afferent, which means that we're using our glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 6, from the cardoid, I don't know why I can't ever say this word, cardoid sinus. Which then, we also have our cranial nerve X. So cranial nerve X, which is our vagus nerve, is from the aortic arch. And then these are going to our brain stem. Then we have our efferent pathway, which is going from our brain stem to the rest of the body. So it would be parasympathetic, which would be the vagus nerve, so CNX, and then sympathetic, which would be our cardiac sympathetic nerves. And then we have and then it also could go to our adrenal medulla, which would release epinephrine or norepinephrine. And then the effector organs that it can go to would be to the heart, which you could either increase or decrease cardiac output, and then arterioles. And then we have our chemoreceptor reflex as well. Explain MAP. Okay, I don't need to, okay, yeah, okay. We don't need to talk about that. We don't need to talk about that. Okay, so we have our mean arterial pressure and how that could basically affect it.